Hello, and welcome back to Autistic Mic Drop with me, Rian Reyes. Before I continue the second episode, I realized that in the first one I didn't really explain what this is. Essentially, this is just going to be like a small segment where I kind of rant about stuff that I know a lot about because of my hyper-focus and my autism and how I like to learn about things. A lot of people reacted really well to me talking about my different neurodivergencies, so this episode is actually going to be about my autism, how I understand it, my experience with it, and the few facts that I know about it. To start off, I kind of want to explain, at least from my point of view, what autism is, because I feel like that's what leads to a lot of misconceptions, is people misunderstanding the diagnosis and then treating it how they think it is rather than how it actually is. So essentially, autism is a different type of thinking. It's a brain that accepts information completely different than how most people accept information. One of the funnier analogies I like to use is like people are used to the phrase monkey see, monkey do. With autism, monkey see, monkey wonders why everyone's doing that. Another way of putting it is like our brain accepts all information at once and it doesn't know how to determine which information is important to focus on. That's why the monkey see analogy is adequate, because neurotypical child, they learn from seeing and they figure out the patterns that are specific to their species and they adapt. You know, children learn to talk from hearing other people talk, from repeating phrases until they understand what those phrases mean and then using them appropriately. They learn to walk from watching other people walk. They learn to eat, recognize color and pattern recognition. For someone who's autistic, they're receiving all that same information, but they don't know which parts are important and which parts aren't. So it doesn't occur to them that the parts that only the other humans are doing is what's important. So they never establish that as a basis for like how to function. And that's why you have a lot of children with autism who, even though they understand color and pattern recognition at a young age, they might not speak until they're 4 or 5 like me. They might not speak at all well into adulthood. They also might exhibit other kinds of dysfunction. We just process information differently, and that's why there's such an array and variety of responses when you look at people with autism. That's why it ranges from people who are very debilitated by their autism and people who seem to function for the most part. And that goes into another conversation that I have a lot, which is deconstructing the use of the terms high and low functioning, because they're terms that don't benefit the autistic community. They only benefit neurotypical people. And the reason that is because, well, first of all, I want to explain some history. Whether or not you agree with the use of the term high functioning, whether or not you agree with the use of the term Asperger's syndrome, I want to explain where those two things come from, because they come from the same person. They come from a man named Johann Asperger, who was a German scientist who was recruited by the Nazis. Now, he was technically never in the service, but he worked exclusively for the Nazis. And his research benefited from their funding, and he used the people that they held captive during World War II as his test subjects for his research. So the disorder that's named after him, Asperger's syndrome, is autism, but it directly correlates with the use of the term high functioning. He developed the terms high and low functioning in relation to autism. Like, he was the first person to start using those terms in regards to autistic people. But what people nowadays don't understand is the reason he was using those terms was because he was determining which children were functioning enough that they would benefit the work camps and which children were dysfunctional enough that you didn't have to bother helping them. And the children that were deemed dysfunctional were sent elsewhere. They were sent to gas chambers. They were sent, and so unfortunately only 2 children were ever confirmed as being killed as a result of his research directly, but because people didn't recognize his research until years after he died, there's actually no official record of how many children were part of his experiments and his research. So now that you know the history, when you look at how he was using it then and you look at how we use it now, I hope you can understand that these terms are only beneficial to neurotypicals because they're not accurate depictions of the struggles that each individual with autism goes through. They're not accurate depictions of what they might need aid with, and they're not accurate depictions of what is considered severe or not severe in terms of autism. I want to preface this by saying that yes, there are people with the same diagnosis as me who can't eat on their own or take care of themselves without assistance, are nonverbal even into adulthood. There are people that require a wheelchair. I understand and recognize that. What we mean by there is no high and low functioning is because of how autism works, some children just happen to figure out how to get around that block in their head. Like, I was nonverbal until 4 years old, and I happened to figure out how to talk. And there was just as much chance that now as an adult, I'd be one of those autistic people who could not express themselves verbally and would have to find other means. You know, I meet people all the time who are homeless or unemployed because they can't speak, so they're seen as unintelligent, but they understand proper sign language. They message they communicate using like Zoom and Skype, and they have like automated texts that speak for them. They're other than being unable to talk, they're a fully functioning person, but they're still deemed less functioning than me because I can speak eloquently and they can't. And so that's why the whole point of high and low functioning is actually arbitrary. It's also like, when it comes to high and low functioning, when it comes to being diagnosed with Asperger's specifically, the criteria for that is arbitrary. One doctor in one state could tell you have Asperger's syndrome, and then in another state, a completely different doctor could tell you that you don't have autism at all based on their criteria. The criteria for being high functioning is so weak and like so up to the individual physician that it kind of means nothing. If you have an Asperger's diagnosis, you have autism. And there are people that want to hold on to that for some reason, but I feel like it's because of the negative connotation associated with autism, people still affiliate it with a sign of retardation or a form of retardation. Autism is not retardation, and it hasn't been considered that since the 40s. It's a completely separate diagnosis, and so many other people have autism. That brings me to the next thing I want to talk about. I'm trying to be a comedian, I'm trying to be an actor, and because I'm trying to like function in a job that requires a lot of like interaction and requires me to like work on my speaking, because I haven't always been a good speaker. Even though I started speaking at 4, I didn't like speaking to complete strangers until like 21. Like, I couldn't speak to literally anyone new without someone beside me to speak for me until I was comfortable. And so now that I'm in this field, people use this thing that I'm trying to pursue as a sign that I'm not autistic, or that I'm only using it for clout. It's like, that's not true at all. Autistic people have been in the entertainment industry for a very long time, and just like a few examples can show you like how long we've been here. We've kind of been here the whole time regardless. But like Anthony Hopkins from the Hannibal Lecter movies, and from, what was that one reboot that everyone liked, the werewolf movie? You know who Anthony Hopkins is. He's autistic. Who's another one? Dan Aykroyd, who I like because he's like one of the co-creators of the Ghostbusters. Without autism, you don't have Ghostbusters. He's autistic. And he was diagnosed like when he was in school. Albert Einstein was diagnosed with autism. And, you know, he's a world-renowned physicist. He's also kind of a misogynist and an asshole, but that's not the point. That's not because of autism. That's just because he's shitty. What's her name? Dylan Hannah, the one-eyed woman from the Kill Bill movies. She's also in the Little Rascals reboot. She's autistic. There's like a lot of, and those are just actors. There's also like writers and directors who have autism and work in this industry and have been working in this industry since its creation, and people just haven't been paying attention. The other thing is, like, people take the sudden rise in diagnosis over the last 20 to 30 years as a sign that it's either fake or that people are being diagnosed for the sake of like, more and more people are pretending that they have autism because they want to be a part of a community. And that's also not true. Like, the thing that to understand about psychology and all of these disorders that seem to be having higher and higher numbers is, one, the current population of the planet is higher than it's ever been. And two, these signs, these symptoms have always existed. We just now know what's causing them, what they are affiliated with. And now we know what to call it when someone acts like this. Before, you would come up with a name like, oh, that person's strange, that person's queer. Some people would call that person like a quagmire, and nobody would understand what that meant. That was just like them saying that person is odd and we should avoid them. And now you know why that person is so weird or different and how to understand and interact with that person. That's what all of this new information means. It doesn't mean more and more people are having autism. It means that now you're able to notice more people have autism. Hopefully that helps you understand that autism is, just because someone can speak and looks like they can function, it doesn't mean that they're not autistic or they're not as autistic as someone who can't do those things. Because autism has such a wide range of symptoms, not everybody exhibits the same ones. And that's where we come to the idea of the spectrum. When people think of the spectrum, especially like older generations, they think of a graduating grid of like lowest to highest functioning autism. That's not what the spectrum is. That's not even an accurate depiction of a spectrum. That's a grid. That's a chart. So when we refer to, and I'm gonna ask this now just so we have it, if we can put it up like right here. When we refer to an actual spectrum, it looks more like a color wheel, like when you're picking up pellets. There's like different quadrants of symptoms, and each autistic person has an individual score in each category. That means that they're exhibiting specific symptoms in specific categories in regards to their journey with autism. Every person is different when it comes to autism. It's kind of like that saying, all thumbs are fingers, but not all fingers are thumbs. It's like not everyone's going to show the exact same symptoms, but a lot of them are going to show some common symptoms. One of them is often inability to speak at a young age. And for the most part, most autistic people don't start talking until maybe 4 or 5. There are some exceptions, and in fact, I don't mean to digress too much, but in fact, even that isn't the most common symptom. The nonverbal trait is actually higher in boys than girls, and because of that, there was a very long time where people thought girls couldn't have autism, but that's also not true. And in fact, I forget her name right now, but if we can Google it later and put her face up, there's a prominent young actress on a show on Netflix, like is becoming like super famous right now because she's like a well-known, not only is she a well-known autistic actress from Australia, but she's an advocate for autism and understanding autism. Another thing I want to break down real quick is the idea of masking. People hear about masking and they hear about stimming, and everyone does this. Everyone masks and everyone has stimulated actions. So they don't understand what the difference is between them doing it and someone with autism doing it. The difference is intent. When a regular person masks, they don't always know that they're masking it. It's second nature. It's something they learn from observing. It goes back to that thing I said at the beginning, monkey see, monkey do. With an autistic person, in their head, they have to tell themselves to do that on purpose because they're trying to look like everyone else. Everyone else does it because it's just what comes natural. They're doing it so that they look like everyone, and so they look natural. It's kind of like that old Chappelle sketch when he has the camcorder that reads people's minds, and he passes over the white guy, and the white guy has to count his steps as he's moving, and he can't distract himself. That's honestly, ironically, like a perfect metaphor for autism and masking, is we have to tell ourselves the steps to looking normal in public. And then as far as stimming, like everyone stims, people get restless legs, people like pat their knees. With an autistic person, it's more reactionary, and it's directly related to their feeling at that moment. If they're feeling overstimulated, or if they're feeling happy and like a sudden burst of joy, they do those same movements, but it's a bit more sporadic. It's a bit more like, like they'll shake their hands a lot, or they'll start squeezing them suddenly, or they just they start shaking. And so it's just about intent, and it's about where it comes from. So yeah, everyone does it, but autistic people do it for a different reason. Anyway, so we're going on 20 minutes, so I'm gonna kind of round this out because we have a guest coming for the main show, un poquito. Check it out. The link's in the bio and everything. The last thing I'll say is there's a lot of talk about undiagnosed validity. If you hear these things about autistic people, and if you identify with that, specifically, I don't just mean if you think you stim or you think you mask, but if you identify with the reasons for stimming and masking, or the reasons for sensory overload, there's a good chance that you might be. And Self-diagnosis is valid when it's coming from a sense of familiarity and understanding. When you've researched autism and you think you identify with the other people that you know that have been diagnosed, there's probably a good chance. Self-diagnosis is valid when it's about comparative identity. When I feel like it's not valid is when people are saying, well, everyone's a little autistic, or when people are saying, well, everyone's a little weird, I don't think autism's real. That's not the same thing as self-diagnosis. That's something different. That's something people need to like take the time to look at themselves and wonder why they're so defensive about autistic people and like acknowledging marginalized groups. That's a whole different conversation. The last thing I'll say is if you are wondering and you want something to kind of give yourself like a physical idea of where you might be at, the best thing I can recommend is you Google the RADS-R test. It's RAADS-R. And it's a personality test that ranges from a few. It goes over the different quadrants of the spectrum through its questionnaire. It usually takes like 30 minutes, and there's like 2 other associated personality tests connected to it. And it's not just about getting a high score with this test, at least for me. When you take this test, you'll find that a lot of the questions they're asking are phrased in a very specific way that will only make sense to people with autism. So it's a great way of understanding, really, if you identify with how autistic people talk about themselves. Because they'll phrase questions like, I'm not going to spoil the whole test, but one of the questions is something along the lines of, when you look at a color or a letter, does it sometimes feel dull to you and then on other times feel very loud and vibrant all of a sudden? It has to do with sensory and overload and when you're overstimulated. And there's questions that you might not get, but there's questions that are phrased in such a way that you'll only really understand what it's saying if you're autistic. So that's a great resource. There's also not a charity, but a company affiliated with that test that is like very forward thinking in terms of helping the autistic community, and they're very separate from a lot of charities you might hear of. I also want to say, if you're like the family member or the caretaker of someone autistic, Autism Speaks, outright, I'm always going to fucking say this, is a piece of shit company. They are a charity that thinks of autism as a thing to be cured. They don't want to understand how autism works. They don't want to accommodate autistic people, and they look at us as a detriment to society. Do not give your money to Autism Speaks. Fuck Autism Speaks. Anyway, instead, Google Embrace Autism, Google the RADS test personality quiz, and support companies that are run either by autistic people or that actually work with autistic people. Look into what your company says, or the company that you're supporting says, the charity that you're supporting says, before you just give them your money. Because Autism Speaks has been a prevalent force in the conversation of autism for a very long time, and they're a very toxic corporation. Embrace Autism, RADS-R test. Thank you for enjoying this 25-minute rant. The next one will probably be about another diagnosis, but I promise I'm also going to talk about comic book shit eventually. So, I don't have a sign off yet, but I'll make one. And for now, don't fly. Skip it.